welcome to SciLux, the podcast where we talk about scientific developments and technological changes. This time, again, one more European episode. So we are not talking to Luxembourg-based scientists, but we're talking to a scientist that is based originally in the UK and was nice enough to actually join us from a bit of a distant place. So thank you, Charles, very much for doing that today. And thank you for coming, of course, as well. Okay, and who is Charles? Because I only mentioned the first name and we should have a bigger introduction. So Professor Charles Spence is the head of the Crossmodal Research Laboratory at the University of Oxford, and he is interested in how our brains manage to process the information from each of our different senses to form the extraordinarily rich multisensory experiences that fill our daily lives. So yes, so we'll be talking a lot about psychology and psychology of senses today. I think that the listeners of the podcast are people who are curious. I'm extremely curious myself. And what I noticed from your research is that, in my opinion, it very much stems from curiosity as well. The ideas for your experiments you get because you're so curious about the world. And what do you think, for you personally, where does that curiosity come from?
Well, I'd say maybe it's as much having fun as anything else. And I think there are probably all manner of questions that one could ask that might have an interesting answer, but which would take an awfully long time to get an answer to. So for myself and for my students in Oxford, I guess, always trying to think of, what are the interesting questions that can be answered quickly, and let somebody else do the answer the interesting questions that take a long time to answer. And then if you can answer the interesting questions quickly, you can ask more of them and find out more stuff. And so if you've got an interesting question then that you can answer quickly, then it's hard not to be curious. And probably what drew me into psychology in the very first place was, whether it was 35, 40 years ago, was a feeling in lots of other sciences, people knew what the answers were. You were told it's more about sort of learning the facts of the matter. Whereas for psychology, it felt like there was a lot more that was unknown, and that you didn't need a lot of equipment to people couldn't really rest on their laurels, as it were. If you thought somebody was wrong, then it might well not take much money or much time to prove them wrong. Just required an intelligent experiment, and so that makes it sort of fun. And if you can find answers to the things you find curious, then that's sort of rewarding in its own right. As long as you sort of believe that what you found out is probably the truth. Which can't be guaranteed these days in psychology. And there's just so much that we don't know, I guess, partly because psychology is I suppose, a relatively new science or subject. I mean, there's a lot left to know. Probably the brain is the most complex thing out there, and hence there are lots of interesting questions and unknowns.
Doesn't it tire you that sometimes when you ask the question, then whenever you get an interview with a journalist, it just keeps popping up again and again? I was just listening to some of your interviews and I could feel that, or reading as well, there was always the discussion of the crisps as well. Yeah. Even Wikipedia has still that mention as
is it?
Yeah, okay. Exactly. I know you don't have influence over what is written in Wikipedia, but still, It's there.
My parents, or my parent who's still alive, then they always say, "Oh no, not the crisps again," when they hear something. Or for a few years, it was the smelly candles, enhancing well-being through kind of scenting the home. That one sort of died down a bit now, but the crisp seems to continue to fascinate in ways that was entirely unexpected and surprising, but also I think very interesting, because we still don't know in a way the answer to why we like noisy foods. It's sort of, I wouldn't say it's one of life's great mysteries, but it's certainly a mystery of life. And even that paper came out in 2004. We got the Ig Nobel Prize for Nutrition in 2008 for it. So after getting the Ig Nobel Prize, then the Ig Nobel winners often invited to go around the world to student campuses and try and enthuse, young students about science by telling the story of their Ig Nobel that they won. And having to stand up again and again over the years in front of such an audience, you sort of feel a bit... you have to have something new to say as time goes on. And hence that sort of led into more research, from the sound of the crisp to the sound of the crisp packet to the sound of the place in which that crisp packet and crisp are munched and crunched. And so it goes on to even today. I think, the sort of sound and taste, sound and flavour is a key part of our research. One that hasn't been much investigated, but which has been, a lot of fun to probe and experiment with.
Before we move on and dig deeper into your research, of course, you mentioned Ig Nobel, so I also wanted to ask you, because as you're the first person who received an Ig Nobel, who is a guest to our show, I was just wondering, do you feel it helps actually as a researcher or not?
Absolutely, I think, and just in terms of publicity and the fact that, journalists, so it does crop up again, what is now 21 years after the paper was published. So I think any sort of press interest is probably good interest on the one hand. My co-author, Max Zampini, who was the lead author on the paper, he was just a postdoc at the time in my lab in Oxford, and he was very embarrassed and didn't want to accept it, saying no one will ever take me seriously in Italy. But after a couple of years, he came around and accepted the award from an Italian Nobel Prize winner in an Italian ceremony, and now he is a professor himself, so I think it didn't do him any long-term harm. And it just sort of took us completely by surprise, because this was research that we were doing. The lab was funded by Unilever for more or less the first 13 years. I've been in Oxford since 1997. The idea for the experiment came up by kind of accident, really. We were working on the sound of clothing, how you could change the sound of clothing when it came out of the wash for their kind of washing powders division. And we were also working on another project on colour and tea, why fruit tea smelled great, looked great, but tasted of nothing. And then one day we thought we can put those two things together, and that became the Sonic chip, published in an obscure sensory science journal that no one ever reads nor cites, and it would have disappeared for good, and then suddenly got picked up by the Ig Nobel people who thought it was rather funny. And life has never been quite the same since.
So you can never guess, right, which experiment will be that one?
Yeah. And that's sort of true generally of, I think now after publishing papers since 1990 or something there, 1992, whatever that makes it, 33 years. And looking back, some papers have done incredibly well, others have disappeared without a trace, and that sort of seems to have no relation to how good you think they are or how much effort you put into them. So my sort of view now is you just sort of throw lots of stuff out there, and some of it will stick. It's impossible to predict what it will be, but it'll be interesting in hindsight to wonder why this or that or the other thing resonates with people, and other things, just vanish.
That's a question I ask myself as well with some of the interviews, because, I'm super satisfied and I think it's a very poignant and important subject, and then it just doesn't get that many listens as something that I was not even enjoying preparing for, but then somehow, it just gets picked up. So it's always a very good question. But now let's circle back a little bit and tell people a little bit what your research really is about. So if I were to summarize it, you're looking at senses and their intersection, or how they communicate and create something, let's say, in our experience. Mm-hmm. Could I say it this way?
More or less. So I'm based in a psychology department, and the lab has been mostly funded by industry of some description or other over the last 27 years in Oxford. And so, we're really interested in thinking about how the senses communicate one with another. And over the years, we sort of added senses to the mix. I started out my PhD in the 90s on sort of hearing and vision. And after a couple of years, brought in touch as another sense to look at the combination, and then pain. And then once we'd run out of things to do there, then bring in smell, and then taste. And eventually you're in the world of flavour. And it's perhaps there where most of the research has focused over the last 2 decades. Initially, I was working a lot on interface design, on working with the European Space Agency, on multi-window displays for early kind of computers and things, and on warning signals for car drivers. It's a lot of technology, and how technology, especially when it stimulates multiple senses, often doesn't obey the same rules or logic as our senses have evolved for. In particular, that we like to look and listen in the same place and find it hard to look in one direction and listen somewhere else. And over the years, that sort of switched from that sort of technology focus of how the senses connect and how you can design better. For example, we worked with Toyota in Belgium, so nearby, to look at whether we could design a warning signal for car drivers that would stimulate parts of the brain that other warning signals don't get to, which I think we sort of succeeded in, putting it behind the head. But all that research was great. But ultimately, it turned out even if you had the best experiment and found out the most amazing thing about how the brain works and the senses connect, it would take probably 20 years before that insight made it into a car that somebody could buy and drive around in. So innovation happens very, very slowly, if at all. Whereas when we sort of switched into the world of food and drink, or sort of dragged into it, really, I would never have thought of studying flavour, because that's not what psychologists study. They study the higher senses of hearing and vision, and it's food scientists who study flavour. But once we got into flavour, it sort of made sense in that was the most multi-sensory thing we do. It really does stimulate, each and every one of our senses. It was something that not many other people were looking at from a psychology perspective. I always tell my students that's a good area to don't focus on what everyone else is looking at, because it's hard to do something innovative. Try and find the bits that no one else thinks is interesting yet and sort of turn it into something. And through that, this most multisensory of experiences that no one was looking at. And then it turned out if you found something there and you had the ear of a chef or a barista or a mixologist or a perfumier or a chocolatier, then they could take that insight and turn it into a dish, or turn it into inspiration, should we say, for a dish that they then create and put on their menus. So suddenly innovation happened much, much faster. And I saw time and again how the chef, if they're interested, would take that scientific insight, put it on their menu, and you'd have people paying good money for a real experience that hopefully was enhanced through a better understanding of the senses. And that becomes sort of rewarding in its own way to see that the science and the findings sort of make it out from the pages of the journal and from the labs of the department into the real world. And these sort of top chefs especially seem to be able to take the science and make it interesting to a broader audience and delicious in a way that many of the kind of scientists we were working with in the food and beverage industry, they could take the science and turn it into something, but it was sort of horrible. You could sort of see the science in there, but it's not anything you think anybody would ever want to pay money for. Whereas the chefs have this sort of magical ability to almost immediately transform the science that they find interesting into a dish or a drink.
So what I see is that you are also ultimately looking for faster results, which, I have to say that not all of my guests are into that, especially the ones that are more into fundamental science, let's say. It's, they kind of accept that, yes, maybe one day, but it's more really digging very deep. And here I see a quest on faster results perceived by general audience. Why is that, you think?
Well, sometimes I think it's because my parents never went to school, so they're sort of a bit mystified by what exactly I can get paid for. Psychology. They pay you to do 16 lectures a year? How can that be? How can that be right and justified? And why do we need a psychologist? Their other favourite line used to be, why do we need a psychologist to tell us that? So much it seems like the science of the bleeding obvious is there. That's my father's way of phrasing it. And so almost in a way in the back of your mind to try and justify what you do is much easier if it has some impact in the real world. Whereas I know too many of the lab-based research and findings, at least in psychology, sort of tend to go round and round in circles every 10 years or 20 years, the debate, and never sort of gets anywhere. It's also been nice, and not planned, is that when you go to a normal psychology conference, then the food's terrible. But start working with chefs and suddenly you get to eat some very nice food, and that's a perk of the job. And once I start eating at some of these restaurants I could never afford on an academic salary to visit, then my kind of research path changed into this more immediately applied way of doing things. You could say, well, some of the more fundamental scientists, and I'm sure they're also, for me, I think that I don't really have any grants and I don't really have any plan or any vision, just see what happens and what crops up and who walks through the door, and then turn that into an experiment. So I think I worry that this sort of the approach that if you have long-term research that requires lots of equipment and staff to keep the machines running, then that requires so much sort of planning and forethought in terms of getting the grants that, I see my colleagues and they're predicting with their Gantt charts, predicting 5.5 years from today, in quarter 3, I'll be doing this and writing that and applying for the next grant. And I sort of feel that stymies fun, and it stymies kind of innovation, and it stymies this ability to respond to the things that just crop up that are, I'd never thought a year ago this was going to happen, but it's really interesting. So, for example, with the emergence of sort of Chat GPT over the last few years, I guess none of us were predicting how much that would have exploded, say, in 2020. But now we're starting to think, well, can we replace our human participants by Chat GPT? Ask Chat GPT 100 times the same question, and is that equivalent to what I would get if I brought 100 participants into my lab, say? And our ability to ask those sorts of questions, or to use AI to generate food images that we're doing a lot of at the moment, is in a very much sort of a responsive mode, because somebody walked through the door who knows how to use this technology. And it's just, most of what I do is just sort of connecting people with different skill sets. It's all very sort of spontaneous, I guess. But that doesn't necessarily mean, coming back to the fundamental thing, that it isn't fundamental. I think there can be, some of the research we do is very fundamental too, and that can be a bit more can still be spontaneous, maybe.
It's getting very philosophical, I guess, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's why we end up working quite a lot with philosophers on some of these questions about how the senses connect. But to design, sometimes to design very simple experiments that don't need much kit, that may crop up in the moment from a discussion that then can be tested, within a day or within a week, and you have an answer that may tell you something fundamental about the way the mind works. And I think for me, whatever the first years, I was always thinking about the senses and how they connect in terms of, do the senses come in the same place? Do they happen at the same time? And it's all sort of space and timing was a key thing. Whereas now I think more about these more fundamental connections between the senses, the more surprising, almost synesthetic connections. Why do people think that sweet tasting foods are round? Why do they think they're pink? Why do they think they're high pitched? Why do they think they sound like a tinkling piano or flute rather than a brass instrument or wind instrument? Why a sour tastes angular? And we all feel these sort of surprising connections, and no one knows quite yet why. Maybe there are multiple explanations for this. But if you go back in the sort of historical record, you find Swedenborg in the 1700s and others getting almost mystical about these connections. We connect the senses in these strange ways. We can't explain why, but maybe it tells us something fundamental, let's say, about the universe or the way our mind is constructed.
Yeah, before I actually ask you a little bit more about how you design your experiments, because that's also very interesting to me, I think it's a good moment, because you went back a little bit to taste as such as well, to ask our listeners the pub quiz questions. So listeners, remember, the question is more or less in the beginning. I'm saying more or less because it's not exactly beginning anymore of the podcast, and the answer only at the end.
What percentage of what you taste do you actually smell?
Okay, great. So we have numbers here, right?
Numbers. I'd like to give you 5 choices. Yeah. Is it A, 80% of what we taste, we smell? Is it 50% of what we taste, we smell? 0% of what we taste, what we smell? It's all taste. Some more answers, or will 3 do?
3 will do. I think you said 4 in the beginning, but it's fine.
I don't know. We'll go. Yes.
Yes.
Oh, well, 4th one would be 95. It's 95% of what we taste, we actually smell.
Okay, perfect.
95, 80, 50, or 0.
So remember, answer only at the end of the podcast. You said something about this, mystical thing of the senses, kind of communicating and all that. So, when we talk about situations that we feel are out of our control, if you want, right? So we don't know that if we're eating a round chocolate, it's going to taste sweeter or whatever. Can we talk about manipulation in this case or not?
Absolutely. I think when I do talks, say, around food and the future of food and the senses and designing new food experiences, then, as I say, we have been mostly funded by food and beverage industry in recent years. And the question will crop up at the end is this ethical? That if you change the color of the food, people will say it tastes sweeter. Wouldn't that make them eat more? And when you say that by changing the music in the store or the restaurant, you can radically change what people order and how much they spend, that seems entirely unethical to me. And what do you say about that? So is this manipulation in the marketplace, which I say, yes, it very much can be. And for me, that's sort of a compliment, or I like to hear that question because it implies, I think, a change from decades ago when I'd talk to similar audiences or to companies or to hospitals. For example, I remember going to the Oxford Hospital where I'm based and asking there about, why are you serving food to patients on a red tray? Don't you realize this is an avoidance motivation cue? The research says this will be bad. They won't eat enough. They won't recover fast enough. And you've got people who aren't eating enough and you're giving them the wrong coloured tray to eat from. And again, don't be silly. What are you talking about? How can the colour of a tray change the taste of the food? That's sort of nonsense. Off you go. And then sort of 20 years later, after we worked with the world's top chef, Ferran Adrià, and showed that the colour of the plate does change the taste of the food and how much you like it, then suddenly people go, well, isn't this manipulation? People will be, the fast food companies of this world will be making us eat more, drink more without our awareness. This is shocking. But that sort of, for me, implies that people are taking the science seriously now in a way that they weren't before. And once you've got to that stage, then for me, I think the insights are just observations about how we respond to the world, how the senses are connected. And any scientific insight, around the senses or anything else could be used for good or evil, as it were. And that's sort of partly why, in answer to that question about manipulation, my last book from 2021, Sense Hacking, was very much sort of taking this new science of the senses and their connections and putting them in the hands of anybody to say, for you at home, how you could use these insights that maybe were discovered by companies wanting to manipulate you. You could use all of them in your own home to make your food taste better, to help you to eat less, to sleep better, to work more effectively, to perform better at the gym, and so on. I think those insights are just that. I do believe that they are important. I do believe that people don't necessarily take them seriously because it's not how the world feels to any of us. I mean, none of us think that the color of a plate changes the taste of food. None of us think that the shape of the glass changes the taste of the wine. I know what the wine tastes like in the glass. I know what that cake tastes like on the plate. And I wouldn't be fooled by you changing the music or changing the lighting or changing the softness of the chair or changing the weight of the cutlery, because I know what food tastes like. We all believe that. Psychologist, gastrophysicist, anybody alike. And because that's not how we feel the world works, then we sort of, maybe ignore this stuff, say, well, maybe it applies to somebody else, or I don't know what goes on in Oxford, but that's not me. I know what food really tastes like, so I don't need to think about these sort of insights and findings. And yet, the more we study, the more we realize how profoundly our judgments are affected by everything else, by these non-food cues, say. And so for me, that's why I always like to start the last two of the last three food books, The Perfect Meal from 2014 and Gastrophysics in 2017, with the sort of Provençal rosé paradox as this sort of phenomenon that everyone has had, especially Northern Europeans, of going on holiday to the Mediterranean in the summer with your family and your holiday, and the rosé wine tastes wonderful by the beach. So nice, you want to buy some of that wine or sausages or cheese and bring it back home. And when you do so and taste it on a cold winter's night, then it doesn't taste the same. Sort of something's lost. And everyone has a version of the Provençal rosé paradox. My Taiwanese students say tea tastes better in England than it does when they take it home to their parents back in Taiwan. And I think that the fact that that paradox resonates with all of us implies that, has the wine really changed? No, it's the same wine, but your experience of it's changed. So we all of us within ourselves kind of hold these two opposite opinions. I can really taste the food. I wouldn't be fooled by any of these other sensory manipulations. And on the other hand, wine does taste better in the Mediterranean, even though it's the same wine. So how can that be? Maybe by getting people to, drawing their attention to the Provençal rosé paradox maybe provides a way in for them taking more seriously some of these other results that don't intuitively feel right, don't intuitively feel like they describe us, and yet clearly do.
Which leads me to, how does it feel to be a psychologist living in the world when you know all this? Are you fooled as well, or you're hacking your senses easily?
No, I think I'm fooled as well. And for me, it's a trip when I'm always on the lookout for the next experiment to do. And hence, a trip to a fancy restaurant, a trip to the supermarket, a trip to the local pub, any and all of those may make you think about what the next experiment is going to be. I go to the pub across the road in Oxford, the Victoria Arms, and then they're playing all this sort of great music of the 80s. I had Depeche Mode and the Smiths and stuff. And that's strange. Well, how do they know what music I like? And then you look around and everyone's a 50-year-old male. And it's sort of, manipulation through music in a way. And you've been had, or if that's the right word, I mean, you enjoy your beer more, I think, because the music matches and it's familiar and liked by you. I go to the supermarket and I see all the sort of logos and labels and wonder why do so many beers have angular labels on them? And that turns out because, we all think that bitterness and carbonation are angular and sweetness is round, and the marketeers have intuitively found that. And goes on to the restaurants and being in Barcelona a few years ago now, and some fancy restaurant I was taken to, Montbar, and there they were serving all the food on just one side of the plate. The other half of the plate was completely empty, white, and that got me thinking, I wonder why that. I wonder why they do that. I wonder if it makes a difference. And that becomes our next experiment, working with chefs and kitchens and others to present food symmetrically, asymmetrically on the plate, and they just ask people, what do you think? How intelligent was the chef? How creative were they? How much would he pay for this plate? And so, I think I'm probably as fooled. Whenever I go to a restaurant, then the first thing I always do is sort of pick up the cutlery, see how heavy it is. And for people, if they ever come round for dinner, they're often terrified. What do I get? The gastrophysicist, it's all about the sciences of the food, and I've no idea which wine to buy. And I just tell them, put it in a heavy bottle and tell me it's expensive, and I'll be happy, and I will. So even though I know that these are the tricks, doesn't eliminate their effectiveness, and there is a huge number of other things out there just right in front of our eyes that we never think about studying scientifically. Like even just like the cutlery itself. There's so many people in the food science world, and they all study the coffee, but no one studies the coffee cup. They all study the tea leaves and how to brew it, but no one studies the teacup. Everyone studies the food we eat, but no one studies the cutlery, what impact it might have. But most of the things we eat come to our mouth by way of knife, fork, or spoon. And until 2011, when we did our first study, no one had scientifically studied. Does the weight, does the material, does the shape, does the balance, does the color, do any of these things or all of these things affect the way food tastes? And it's right there in front of us, mediating all of our food experiences, and no one thought it worth us. And time again, you find that these very obvious things are right there in front of us in our daily life. And just a question, I wonder why things are done that way, and I wonder what impact it might have. And there's your experiment.
Yeah, it makes me think that I'm just going to go back now to my husband and say, can we please change the plates we've had for 20 years? Because now I can scientifically prove that our whole food experience is going to be better. But yeah, thank you for providing that, because we've been discussing it for quite some time. Yeah, but anyway, I get how you get the ideas, right? So as you said, you just walk down the street, you go to a pub or you go to a restaurant and you start wondering. But then you have to move on to designing the experiment, right? And how do you design a psychology experiment that it's reproducible, it's foolproof, and you're satisfied with it?
So I guess the first thing, take a case of a food experiment on, say, the weight of cutlery as an example. How do you study that? Then look at two paths, either these sort of physical objects that you have to hold, so you can't do this kind of experiment on the internet in this case. When we do plating experiments, then we can do many of those on the internet. But you have the first choice between, is it very well-controlled laboratory study, or is it a more ecologically valid real-world study where you have less control? So ideally, what we try and do is the same experiments, or more or less the same experiments, both in the laboratory, very well controlled, but not very ecologically valid. Probably with these weird, as we call them these days, Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic boys and girls studying psychology, who aren't necessarily very representative of the population at whole. And at the same time or thereafter, do a real world experiment in a cafe, a restaurant. And hopefully, if the results turn out similarly in both cases, then you can say we have the good control, but we also have the ecological validity. Therefore, heavier cutlery really does make food taste better. And for that, in the restaurant case, what we did is then you've got to find a real world situation where you can do this study. You've got to convince a chef so we did experiments both in my college at Somerville College in Oxford, when the parents came back to see their offspring. They had like a dining hall with 150 people. And that's perfect. I spoke to the chef, Paul, and he was keen. And so we had an experimental lunch for the parents and their offspring. And half of the tables had light cutlery. The other half of the tables had heavy cutlery. They all ate the same food, but they said different things about it depending on the weight of the cutlery in their hand. Then we found, a Scottish hotel restaurant that was willing to do it as part of a conference. So again, half the tables heavy, half the tables light. Works there. And then back it up in the laboratory with experiments where people eat not very nice food necessarily. And maybe it's yogurts that have been where we add a bit of sweet, salt, bitter, sour taste too. And then we ask you to sample all of these different yogurts. And so that's very well controlled. All the ratings come from the same people. It's the same person who's tasting from the light and the heavy spoon. Whereas in the restaurant or in the cafe or in the dining hall, it's different people who have. So it goes from a between participants to a within participants design, very highly controlled. And there maybe we certainly find that, heavier is better, but then maybe what also crops up from the laboratory experiment is that there are limits. Things can get too heavy, and that's not good. And also there's this sort of disconnect in some of our experiments in the lab. We had this sort of plastic cutlery that looks metallic. So it looks like it should be heavy, but is actually light. And that turns out to be a bad thing. So lighter than you expect something to be is very bad. It means you're being shortchanged. Whereas heavier than you expect something to be is better. And we add weights to cutlery, to cans of fizzy drink, to boxes of chocolates, to bottles of beer, you name it, and show that, whenever we add weight that you can't see, suddenly people say more better things about the chocolate, the fizzy drink, the food. And that then ends up in one of the world's top restaurants. Sort of indirectly, the Fat Duck had a 3 Michelin star, former world's best restaurant, the Heston Blumenthal. For a while, they were serving a dessert called Counting Sheep that was floating miraculously in the air, levitating. And you had a spoon that was furry to look at. And when you picked it up, it was much heavier than you thought it was going to be because they'd put lead weights hidden under the fur. And so that's both about playing with the texture and the weight of the cutlery, and all kind of inspired by, I would say, experiments that we were doing either in the lab in Oxford, in restaurant or cafeteria, or on occasion at home even. And that sort of furry cutlery, where's that coming from? Was we used to have a chef in residence, Charles Michel, in the lab in Oxford. And once a month, my wife would let us all play. And everyone from the lab would come around. We had 3 chefs at the time we were working with. And that's the chance to do all sorts of bizarre stuff that you couldn't do on a normal working day. And from that kind of sort of playful experimentation at home, just over a dinner party with the students, came Charles Michel. He went to the covered market in Oxford. He bought some hares, but also asked the butcher for the pelts of the hare and made a hare stew, and then took the pelts of the hare and wrapped them around my wife's Christoph fancy silver service cutlery.
Okay.
And, anybody who was there that evening will remember that furry, I certainly do, the furry spoon and the hare that you were smelling, whose life you were eating, kind of. And again, kind of bizarre things you wouldn't really get to do anywhere else. It was there in at home, where the chef also, we started doing plating food like one of Kandinsky's paintings. Then we had 12 of us at home, got 12 canvases from the art store. The chef then made this Kandinsky salad, plated it just like one of Kandinsky's 201 painting in the MoMA in New York. We bought some paintbrushes because you were eating a painting, and ate it not with regular cutlery, but with a paintbrush. And just, lots of sort of crazy fun. But from that then came the experiment in the lab that went on to the restaurant experiment that went into the dining hall experiment as replications. And that sort of, that playful, I think that's a playful space for innovation or experimentation where it doesn't matter. There's no pressure. You don't have to have asked for, I don't think you have to have asked for ethics to have a dinner party and give people food. And you can just play with stuff with much less sort of planning and forethought and justification, because some of these things you'd never imagine would work if you thought about it enough. It's only kind of that pressure of the last minute or the playfulness that says, okay, let's just try this and see what happens. Doesn't matter if it doesn't work. Who cares? It's just a sort of flippant thing. But some of those things do work and then lead into the more formal stuff. And that's, certainly the science, fun, the sort of creative and experimental. And and sort of joyful, and helps feed people's sort of curiosity.
I have a very big problem personally with guests that I invite home that don't have the same relationship to food as I do, right? So this is also an interesting thing, like, all these experiments you're talking about with people, playful, it's a different level of consuming food as such. And then there's also that level of all these people who just treat it as fuel, right? Mm-hmm. Do you ever look at it from that perspective as well, or not? How taste changes, or how senses are different if you're just not into food?
Yes, we do. And I guess sort of historically I've been interested in people's view about the future of food in the past, even today. But in the past, what did people think the food would be like in 100 years from 1885, say, or 1889? And there you go back to 1890s, and they're talking about meal in a pill. The French chemist Berthelot is talking about a meal in a pill, and what's he called? Arthur Bird. I think he's got a book from 1889, The Future of the United States of America in a Century from Now, like that. And there's a food bit, and again he's saying it would make no sense for the busy businessman, as he puts it, of 1999, to be sitting down at lunchtime to eat a 7-course meal. He'd just have a meal pill followed by a dessert pill followed by a soup pill, or the other way around, and get on with his day and be more efficient. So people have long thought about this notion of reducing food to just kind of like necessary nutrition, taking away all the sensory elements. That hasn't come to pass. I guess there is Huel doing quite well as a sort of a meal replacement that tastes horrible and has no sensory deliciousness. But for me, I'm more interested in why this doesn't work and hasn't come to pass, and why even when working with in the European Space Agency and thinking about food, say for long-haul space travel to Mars, and in an environment where every gram counts, that's where you should try. That ought to be the ultimate environment in which meal in a pill would help you to reduce the payload for a multi-year mission. And yes, that's precisely the thing the astronauts, feed back with, as it were. You can do anything, mess with our sleeping arrangements, this, that, and the other, but don't mess with our food, because that's sort of fundamental. So it's so much more than merely nutrition. It plays a very important sort of psychological role as well. And hence, I think it should be more about more stimulation rather than less. And hence why I'm not keen, and I don't think we'll ever be eating a meal in a pill, really, for most of us. Why I don't think dining in the dark is really all that much fun, except maybe once, when you sort of take away the stimulation, when we're into the augmentation of more senses as a better thing. But then I guess we are all neophobic about some foods. All of us don't like something. So you might have guests who are much more restrictive in what they eat, perhaps. But there are a few of us who would be happy to eat insects, or I know what's coming next, plankton or mycelium or other sorts of bacterial foodstuffs that are sustainable. And so we are doing quite a lot, say, of these alternate future foods, future protein sources. How would we psychologically kind of nudge people towards consuming them? Say, for the insects, we've done a lot of work there. Not because we necessarily believe insects will be the future of food, but if we can convince people to love insects, then there's probably nothing else we can't convince people to like. And they're thinking about, everything from the crunch, that, going back to my sonic chip experiment with Max Zampini, if you know that crunch and crackle and crispy is such a desirable attribute in all of our snacks, then if you're going to sell a insect food product, surely it should crunch, especially if it's got a crunchy exoskeleton, like a cricket or something, fry it and then make the most of the crunch. And once you've got noisy food like that, then maybe you should also, put it in a noisy packaging like crisps, because noisy packaging goes together with noisy foods. And then thinking about naming it, and then thinking about, different times of day, that maybe we are all more neophobic at breakfast than we are in the evening. If I said to you, for dinner for the next 10 years, you're going to eat exactly the same thing every day, you'd be horrified. That's exactly what we do for breakfast most of the time. So we have, very sort of our psychology around food changes by time of day, by who we are with, by where we are, that we find that people are more likely to try insects if they're at the pub with friends than on a romantic date. Which is probably one of those things my father would say, you don't need a psychologist to tell us that. But anyway, we did the research to find that out, through then to thinking about, what kind of celebrities would most effectively help to market. Who's the George Clooney of insects, as it were, for him doing it for Nespresso? Who would do it for insect-based cuisine? Is it a chef? Is it a musician, a pop star, a film star? And so, look into those questions of more for these sort of alternate future foods, but then probably some of those insights may also play back to one's guests at home who are less interested in what they eat. And as you mentioned, you said there's also that sort of historical angle as well to things. And so much of my research over these has been focused on the here and now, what you perceive in the moment, say, if you're tasting something. But I've become more interested in sort of your memory of meals and your anticipation of meals. So eating something, a nice food experience, lasts only a short time, but a lot of your pleasure comes from beforehand and after. So there's more of a sort of temporal dimension to things. And then going much further, perhaps from having been to lots of these sort of interdisciplinary conferences with philosophers and art historians, and I've got much more interested in sort of the history of taste, and not just thinking about what I can do to the taste of your pineapple today, but why were pineapples described as, the most delicious tasting food ever 400 years ago when they first came across from Brazil, and how we can track our changing response to the taste of things, or is it the thing itself changes its taste? And there are records, from the first pineapples that only the King of England could taste. And I think it's Locke describing, trying to say in one of his philosophical works, is it possible to describe the taste of a pineapple to somebody who's never tasted it? Because that's 99% of the population are in that position, through to today when we don't think of it as an especially delicious thing, sort of ubiquitous. And time and again, I'm now sort of going through the world of pineapples, potatoes, herbs and spices, just to see the very changing relationship we have with ingredients and with taste over the centuries. Maybe the changing role of appearance, that today so much of our food is shared over the internet, sort of gastro porn or food porn, but it wasn't always thus. And yet, go back to the medieval period and you find they were colouring their foods, not with artificial food colouring, certainly, but deliberately colouring their fish dishes green with parsley, saffron, of course, primarily there for its colour, golden colour, and so on. And that becomes this sort of fascinating quest just to track that much longer timescale of changing tastes, changing relationship to food.
Yeah, there's so much to still discover. I can see, your thoughts going so many different directions. You reminded me, I'm originally from Poland, and there was always the discussion of oranges for Christmas, right? That they would just arrive that one moment and everybody was waiting. And of course, the taste was absolutely different than the taste of oranges now, right? I mean, our tendency in general to say the youth now and the one in the past is completely different, and the same here, right? For taste as well, our perception as such. But I think when we talk about senses, we have to also mention something that is discussed more. I don't know if it's a problem of now or also the past, the sensory overload in general that our world is providing us. So is there something we can do about that?
I think so. And indeed, in a sense hacking book from 2021, I sort of started out talking about the sort of how so many people are complaining about sensory overload nowadays. There's too much information, too many alerts, too many messages, too many emails, and so on. And yet, when you sort of look more closely at what people complain about, it tends to be an overload of the higher rational senses. It's hearing and vision primarily that people complain about. You don't find many people saying, wow, there are too many smells. I just take them away. Give me the nose clip or something. But there are too many tastes, that I have too much touch. Too many, the more emotional senses are not being overstimulated. So I think for me, it's kind of technology is only very good at stimulating our eyes and our ears. It can't really stimulate touch so much, and not at all taste and smell. And hence that sort of, the sort of technological revolution has also led to a biasing of our sensory environment. So we get much more auditory and visual stimulation that does become overloading. But it is, I think, a bit more, not of a sensory overload so much as a sensory imbalance, that our higher rational senses are being overstimulated by technology. What technology can do, our more emotional senses of smell, touch and taste are not being. And in fact, many people complain about touch hunger. It's kind of the thing that people like Tiffany Field in North America writes about, that as people get older, no one wants to touch wrinkly bodies. As we fear litigation, no one wants to touch school children anymore. And so there is a real reduction of tactile stimulation, sensory underload, you might call it even, this sort of touch hunger. That's important to recognize and perhaps to address, given that, your skin is your biggest sensory organ. 22% of body mass is your skin. And if you're not stimulating that, and when you realize also the pleasure receptors and other things you find in the hairy skin that have recently been discovered, then, the clear health and well-being benefits through more effectively upping the stimulation of these more emotional senses. And so perhaps it's that sensory reset or sensory imbalance we need to think about. And that certainly the sensory overload is something that crops up again and again in people's commentaries. Maybe it's even, the restaurants get louder and louder, especially in the States and places that, now you can't hear yourself think. And that's one environment that many people complain as being sensory overloaded. I mean, one of the things that came out of my sort of sense hacking book was the amazing power of kind of nature and nature stimulation. So, I'm here now in the garden in the cloud forest in Colombia. Probably hear some of the birds exotic birds in the background, maybe chirping away. And here, could you have too much nature stimulation? Could you be sensory overloaded? I'm not sure you could, really. Probably more the better for you. The more birds you hear, the better. The more different varieties of plants you see, the better for your mental and physical health, the research shows. So maybe that sensory overload is, and complaints about sensory overload are restricted to these sort of digital technologies and maybe more artificial stimuli.
Yeah, that's a good point. So what we can wish all the listeners is to get more birds chirping in the background rather than, although thanks to technology, we can have this interview today. So it's also a positive note.
Yes.
Let's say, not everything. Okay. Well, I think this is the moment that we have to actually go back to the sense that you said that we don't complain to be the one overloading us. So the sense of taste and smell in this case. So if you can remind our listeners what the pub question was about, and then let's solve it.
So the question was, or how much of what you think you taste actually comes from the sense of smell? And the four choices were 95% of what you taste actually comes from your sense of smell. B, 80% of what you taste actually comes from the sense of smell. C, 50-50, half comes from smell, half comes from taste. Or D, don't be stupid, of course all taste comes from taste, 0%.
And the answer is?
A or B would be acceptable.
Okay.
Going back to the 1970s, it turns out this sort of, factoid of food science first appears, and you find figures in the academic research and in the popular press, anywhere between 75 and 95% of what we think we taste, we actually smell. And giving it an exact percentage, I think, sort of is dangerous because that makes it sound like you have a really precise number.
Ultimate answer.
A range of responses is a bit more true to it. And probably if you doubt it, then the way to think about it is how during COVID, say, or when you have a cold, most people say they lose their sense of taste. And many people who come to my lab in Oxford would say, doctor, I'm not that kind of doctor, but they say, doctor, I've lost my sense of taste. And it turns out most of the time they haven't. Their taste buds, detecting sweet, bitter, salty, sour on the tongue, are perfectly fine. But what they've lost is a sense of smell. And it's a sense of smell that gives you that 75 to 95% that is everything you like in food and drink, the creamy, the meaty, the floral, the herbal, the citrus, the burnt for my wife's cooking, and so on.
Yeah, true. But it also is an important fact for all those people designing the future of food, right? As you said, because that has to come in the mix too.
Again, it's for none of us does it feel like most of what we taste is actually smell. So normally if I'm doing like a multi-sensory dinner, then one of the first little things I'll have on the menu is a nose clip and a jelly bean. You can try this one at home. You don't even need a nose clip. You can just hold your nose closed as if you're going deep sea diving. I get people to pick a jelly bean and then taste it and ask them what they taste. And all they'll be able to say is sweet, maybe acidic, and that's it. Very thin experience. Let's say let go of your nose or take the nose clip off, and suddenly you'll hear the whole room go, as they suddenly get the floral, the peanut butter, the whatever it is. And then a moment later, you're convinced you're tasting that smell in your mouth. That's where it's localized. It's kind of oral, what I call a ventriloquist in the mouth. So it's another of these phenomena that we don't feel. It's our brain integrating the senses, but doing so effortlessly, automatically, without our awareness, and convincing us we are tasting smells in our mouth. And I think it's really important for the future of the food design. My favorite example, or my least favorite example, is kind of all those coffee cups that have plastic lids that allow you to sip your drink and not spill it. But what they singularly don't allow you to do is smell your coffee as you're tasting it. And coffee turns out to be one of the two most liked aromas in the world. Whether or not you like coffee, most people, virtually everyone loves the smell of coffee. And here to have a ubiquitous bit of design, a plastic coffee cup lid where you can taste but you can't smell, just seems utterly crazy. And so a lot of our work with chefs and with companies is to think about, if you know how much of what you taste is actually smell, how would you design a food product differently? How would you design a dish differently? Should we bring back the good old-fashioned cloche, the silver half dome over your food? Because, all the aromas of food are disappearing somewhere between the kitchen and the dining table. All that steam you see is a 75 to 95% that's all gone. And so maybe the cloche helps. There are probably other innovative ways you can add fragrance or enhance the aroma of a dish to improve what people will tell you, will swear they're tasting, but they're actually smelling.
Yeah, I was just thinking as we are talking science and coffee, then if you can do something about coffee at conferences, please, as well. I think it would really help the research. We all, all scientists, many of us, I'm putting myself there as well, many of the scientists drink a lot of coffee. So I think coffee at conferences should be tackled as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it may be, that might actually, probably not, we'll say it might be a version of the Provençal rosé paradox. It might be the conference coffee paradox, we could call it.
Yes, could be.
It might turn out that exactly the same coffee served somewhere else in a heavy mug rather than a styrofoam plastic thing would taste completely different, even though it's the same coffee. But I think actually it probably is really terrible coffee.
Yes, exactly.
Well.
I think that's the main problem. But who knows? Maybe that could be another idea for an experiment at a certain moment.
Yes, and at conferences you're standing up versus maybe often when you drink coffee you're sitting down, and posture might play a role. There's all sorts of things.
Yeah, true. In Italy, normally, you have also this culture of actually taking it on the fly. So you just get into the bar and you go, right? So it's people are more used to doing it standing. Anyway, it's another rabbit hole.
Yeah. And this is one that, in fact, you just described our current research. We've just been going around the world virtually, looking at people's coffee drinking behaviors in 7 different countries, from Turkey to UK to Taiwan to Colombia and elsewhere. Just asking people, and Italy, of course, do you do it standing up, sitting down? Do you do it in the morning, in the evening? Do you add milk or not? To find out these kind of contextual variables that affect
Very interesting. So we'll be looking for the results for sure.
Next time.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Charles, for today, for telling us a little bit. I feel that this was absolutely not enough, but if your listeners are interested, you can definitely check out loads of other interviews and, of course, read the research, the publications that Charles has. I will share some of it in the show notes as well. Thank you so much for discussing it today with us.
Thank you.
And this is it for today. Don't forget to subscribe, to follow us. And of course, remember, we are also on Patreon, so you can support us as well financially, so we can grow and develop and talk to more scientists. This was Scilex, and my name is Hanna Siemaszko.